Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. Lacey, also, uh, I'd like to tell everyone that may have not heard me before. I am actually from Houston. Well, originally from Pennsylvania, but I live in Houston now. So I'm in this part of the United States as much as I can because I think we have you here. But I'm delighted to be here today and piece together for you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And let's talk about what we're going to be focusing on in the short time we have together. So what I want to do is really focus in on many of the conversations that you've been having today and talk to you in terms of when we think of child find and we think of having this vertically aligned process that's helping close gaps for children, but we're also trying to make the decision, is it more than just closing the gap, and do we have possibly one of the 13 IDEA disability conditions that we need to look at? And we do that through that problem solving process that you've been talking about. And my gentle reminder for all of you right now is the problem solving process, and I know you've heard some wonderful speakers today talking about this, is one that of course you have a strong team on your campus that's going to do kind of the heavy lifting for the students in which you are working with, K through 12, but it's a process that really needs to be district supported. And what I mean by that is there is an expectation that even if it's a really small school district, and I've worked in small school districts where literally K to 12 is in one building, or maybe two buildings. And I've worked in very, very large school districts like Houston ISD or Dallas ISD, or even like up in New York. But I guess the issue here is there needs to be a top-down level of support system, meaning from the superintendent, the school board, to those that are in the central office, making some of the decisions that are going to affect the practices of the staff, such as the curriculum and the instruction. So we say it's a district supported problem solving process. So MTSS, a good analogy for MTSS is this. The first time you've heard the term MTSS was when the ESEA Act was reauthorized, and what it stands for is multiple tiered systems of support. RTI has been around for a long time. Actually, the response to intervention term was brought through actually the IDEA back in 2004 when IDEA was reauthorized. And just to clarify so everyone understands what I'm saying, IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is our law governing mind and special ed. And it was in the 2004 federal guidelines for the condition of specific learning disability, which, by the way, is our number one disability, as far as our largest disability condition of the 13. And it says right in there that there must be data to show a lack of response to intervention. And that's where the RTI name came about, in case you didn't know. But MTSS, it really is a broader term that wants the districts to connect both your social emotional component of the problem solving process and your academic together, but it's really thought of as the district framework. And so you'll see in the literature MTSS or RTI, and the best way for you to think about that is MTSS is your district supported system, and the RTI is your campus driven team data-based decision making. That's a good way to look at it. But honestly, I think people get confused when they see all these different terminologies. The other thing that we're going to talk about today is your data and the importance of how you not only identify the sourced data throughout all three tiers for an IDEA disability condition decision. And I think many of you have been in the situation where you may have been asked by a special ed professional for your documentation, and they look at the documentation and they say it really doesn't help me, and then you get frustrated. Well, the documentation really needs to be data driven. So we really need to have good data points in place, and we have to have it documented in a way that really supports us looking at an IDEA condition. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But I think it's critical that that we understand here today that this problem-solving process and data collection process weaves through everything. It weaves through general ed, Section 504, and special ed. So I'm talking all staff here when we talk about this. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go further into IDEA. We definitely want to have a system academically and socially emotionally that is layered and clearly defined, clearly defined, that tells us what the support looks like, or that added intervention, instruction, SEL component at each tier. And we do want to be able to differentiate between what we consider a tier 1, a tier 2, and tier 3. And I think that's very confusing, because what I see in many of the school districts that I'm involved in is triangles upside down, that you're calling things tier 2 that really should be tier 1. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, because from a legal standard and a legal framework, it's very important that you differentiate that out. And just a shout out for everyone that's here today. About half of my job that I do in my practice is in the general ed RTI Section 504 process, designing systems, auditing systems, and working with school districts. And I've been in a few of yours. And the other half of my job, I'm in special ed. So on the days I'm not talking about the RTI, I'm actually training. And if I have some diagnosticians or special ed folks here today, y'all probably know me. I actually do a lot of statewide training on assessment for disabilities. So I kind of have my foot in both doors. And I know it gets frustrating sometimes when a DIAG or a LSSP might say to the RTI team, but show me your data. And the RTI team's going, but here's my data. And it's not data, it's more opinions, and it's more almost like, I've literally seen someone hand me something that looks like a dissertation, and it's just more about the things they did, but not the evidence or the data to support it. And so people get frustrated. We don't want to be frustrated with each other. We want to have a clear idea of what the data looks like and what the intervention looks like. Extremely important, especially if you do a referral for special education. And then I'm going to spend just a little bit of time today giving you a few hints about how you can make your documentation easier. I think that one of the issues I see, and I also testify in local, state, and federal Office of Civil Rights complaints and special ed complaints. And one of the things that I find is sometimes you can over document. So we want to keep your documentation streamlined, and we want it easy for anyone to have access to, and that everyone understands what the concerns are that are going on with the student and what did we do about it. And I think that's a critical point. So as we pull this all together, let me just say this statement. There is no meaning to a score other than what you surround it with. So back in the good old days, and I'm talking probably 80s and 90s, now I'm really going to date myself, we as LSSPs and diagnosticians would open up our test kits. And we would test a kid's IQ, and we'd test achievement. We would ask the teacher a few questions, but literally the IDEA basically said, you come in and you test to see if there's this disability condition. And so we were used to diagnostic scores that gave us this glimpse at a child, and it helped us determine if there was a disability present. And we were doing in all fairness, we did a really great job, but as everything else morphs and grows, our assessments got better. Our assessments got more fine-tuned. We have better availability for looking at norms. And in 2004, the IDEA, and specifically when we're talking about looking at students that had disabilities that were somewhat linked to processing, cognitive processing or intelligence, we were very used to pulling out our test kits and doing what we call confirming the concerns that others had for the students. But over the years, what we were finding is we had this gap where if any of you worked with a student and you were convinced that they had a special ed disability and your diagnostician tested them or your LSSP and they came back and said, no, it's a DNQ, did not qualify, how did you feel? You were probably a little anxious because you knew with all your heart and soul that you were doing everything you could to help this child. And yet here's a special ed person walking down the hall saying, wait a minute, my testing does not support that. And if you've ever been in that situation, I feel your pain because I've been on both sides. I've been on the sides where I've worked with a kid, and I just clearly cannot seem to get the kid moving, whether it's behaviorally, emotionally, or academically, only for the IDEA assessment to come out and say there was not a defined disability condition. Right? And so, your diagnosticians and your LSSPs literally have conditions and they have a framework, a legal framework that tells them what qualifies a kid or not. But starting in 2004, what the IDEA basically said to your diagnosticians and your LSSPs, it is insufficient basically to just go in and test a kid and find a disability. You really need to show educational strengths and weaknesses. You need to show data that says that the student's failure cannot be attributed to something else before we jump in and say it's a within kid issue. That's the big point here. And so the IDEA pretty much wants us to pull in all sources of data that are evidence-based and research-based to tell the story of the student within the context of the FIE. And so, much to my chagrin, I'll write a 35-page FIE and everybody just wants to know what's on page 35. Did they or didn't they qualify? And I'm sitting there going, but the first 34 pages tell you about the kid. And regardless of what we call it, disability or maybe not a disability and additional supports, what's best for that student? And so the idea here was the RTI data that folks believed that a good team collected was the kind of data that helped wrap around the diagnostic data that your special ed folks do to tell us the story. Now, the educational strengths and weaknesses becomes important for the criteria, right? Do they have a disability, right? But the second prong is, do they have a need for specially designed instruction? So you really need to meet both criteria. You have to have a disability to begin with, that IDEA says there is. And number two, do you have sufficient data to say there's a need for special ed? And so this is the point where I'm going to say we got to get out of this emotional process, you need data. Because that specially designed instruction, for any of you who've sat in on an ARD, is defined in the student's PLAF. And so we have the disability condition, then we have a PLAF that tells us all this data is telling us we need more than just general education or more than just some response to intervention. And so these multiple sources of data that you see, in fact, you're seeing that in all of our language. Senate Bill 1153, which I'll talk to you about, it talks about it. In our statewide Child Find Corrective Action we're in, they talk about it. And all of my training with diagnosticians and school psychologists, LSSPs, we talk about how to use multiple sources of data. And actually, just to let y'all know, I am doing a series in several service centers, in several statewide arenas, and in individual districts, just working with diagnosticians and LSSPs on this whole notion of multiple source data and how they need to be pulling your RTI data, because that has been part of our Child Find Corrective Action. So that's very, very important. And so you become, as an RTI team, you become those multiple sources. So let's just put this in context here of this MTSS problem-solving process. I'm sure you've seen some type of a rubric like this. Let's talk about defining the problem. What is the problem? Okay, so if we are concerned about Billy and we're going to put a referral into special ed, we don't want to see something like Billy can't read or Billy's behind grade level. Okay, that's very important. What I would like to see a diagnostician put into their report or LSSP is this: the middle of year response to intervention MTSS universal screener indicates Billy is reading on with automaticity or fluency on, now you fill in what your universal screener is: Ames Web, Dibbles, NWEA, Star Renaissance, whatever you're using. Okay, some of you might still be using iStation. Billy fell at below the 21st percentile on the universal screener for reading at middle of year. Additional data says at beginning of year, his score was consistent in that it fell below the 21st percentile at that point. So your first data point that defines the problem is this: where did Billy's score on the universal screener fall in reference to his grade level peers? Now, most of these universal screeners, the ones that I just named, and I know that TEA is working on a version of TPRI for K through 3, are normed in Texas. So we're talking, we have Texas norms, and the rule of thumb is if a student falls below the 25th percentile, we have a concern. But when does it become a real concern that we're thinking it might be special education? So you also have to do what we call a trend analysis. So the second thing I ask diagnosticians, and I have it somewhere else, and we'll talk about that, is what was the trend analysis? Because when you do your data analysis, what you do 3 times a year is you trend your data. So my question would be, if Billy's in 2nd grade and he fell below the 21st percentile in reading or reading fluency, how many other 2nd graders in the school district fell below the 21st percentile? So if you have more than 20% of your 2nd graders falling below the 21st percentile or 25th percentile, you have a trend. So now I'm not so sure that Billy is that unique. And see, your special ed folks have to do that. They're supposed to be saying, yeah, okay, my first data point tells me that he's below the 25th percentile. My second data point tells me how many other kids fell below the 25th percentile. Very important. Because under IDEA, the question is, did Billy have appropriate access to instruction? This is even more important now post-COVID with the COVID slide. And so we look at first the universal screener, then we look second at your trend and out. Well, I actually tell teams, I actually reverse that. I tell teams first do your trends. Because if you have big trends, then we're probably not going to have a whole lot of kids in tier 2 and tier 3 at this point. We've got to fix the trend where in tier 1. But say you don't have a trend. Say Billy fell below the 25th percentile. He fell in at 21st percentile. And the 2nd graders in your school district, the large majority of them, let's say 85% 25th percentile, have a problem. So we're still looking at what is the problem. So the second thing we ask our diags to do is whatever your district is using for diagnostics for your kids. I'm talking reading now, but you could do the same thing for math. And then if we were on the SEL side, we would have your counselors working with us, because you do need a universal screener on the SEL side as well. But I'm going to stay with reading because that always seems to be the big issue here. Then I tell your diags, what's the district using from a diagnostic perspective for reading? And let's just say, for instance, your district was using the BAS, because several of my districts are. And I found out that the BAS level for Billy was a C, and he should be at an F. I'm just throwing out alphabets here, right? So now I have a defined problem, right? So now the next question is, Billy is definitely one that you're going to have your initial meeting to talk about tier 2. Remember, under Senate Bill 1153, you have to baseline. So our baseline is he's falling below the 21st percentile. He's in a C, which is 1st grade level, let's just say. And so now we're going to baseline him and talk about, why is it occurring? Okay, why is it occurring? Well, the teacher comes in, the teacher gives us some additional data, and she has formative and summative assessments. And it's very clear that Billy is inadequate at sound blending. Let's just say sound blending. Let's even say maybe consonants. So now we know why it's occurring. His fluency or his automaticity isn't anywhere near the other, so he's falling further, further behind. But what's happening now is you're going down and drilling for the skill. So that's what you're supposed to be doing in your tier 2 meeting, but this is the data that your special ed people are being trained to look for, okay? And so now we know that he's about first grade level. We know that he's below the 25th percentile, and we know the why. All right, so step 3 is you decided Billy needs tier 2 interventions. So in your meeting, you're going to write the plan, but the plan is very individualized to Billy. Okay, so you're not going to write a plan to say increase reading fluency. Your plan is going to be help him with his consonants or vowels or whatever it is that your diagnostic saying he's having problems with. And so the plan is also going to be baselined. So your progress monitoring that you all do in RTI, and I know that many of you have had training in this, but your progress monitoring is also an automaticity measure. The biggest mistake that RTI teams make, and I've had to clarify this, especially when I testify in hearings, is your progress monitor does not have a one-to-one correspondence with the TEKS. Anyone that's in tier 2 is below grade level, right? And so your RTI intervention, the plan that you're designing in tier 2 is for skill development. If you want to close the gap to get the kid ready for STAR, that's tier 1. So the question that we have to answer as special ed folks is, did the plan work? So what you're actually progress monitoring is the plan, not the skill, the plan. Because the idea is we would increase Billy's automaticity or fluency in reading if we fix the problem. Does that make sense? So we come in and we say, Billy is reading 35 words correct per minute at a first grade level, right? And he's in second grade. He's middle of the year, second grade. So he's at a first grade level, middle of the year, second grade, and he's reading 35 words correct per minute, baseline. That's what you're sending home to mom. Your plan is by the end of 12 weeks, we expect to increase his automaticity 2 words correct per minute by the end of 12 weeks. So your goal that you're sending the parents is if he was reading 35 words correct per minute, right? So 2 times 12 is 24, so 35 plus 24 is what? 59. We would expect him to be reading 59 words correct per minute automatically and fluently within that first grade reading passage. Notice I didn't say second. We're closing the gap. And if he was, then we'd probably keep him in for another 6 to 9 weeks in tier 2 and hopefully graduate him back to tier 1. But what your diagnostician and your LSSP are looking for is where was he at the end of those 12 weeks? And then, oh, lo and behold, he was only at 42 words correct per minute. At that point, is it working? No. That's when we're looking at either possibly referring to special ed or possibly trying 4 to 6 weeks into your 3rd grade. So I just want to know what you guys should be looking for. They're looking for your universal screening data, your trend analysis data, your plan that you sent home to the parents, which by law says you're going to give them a benchmark, right, baseline, and you're going to tell them how much growth to expect over those 12 weeks that you're monitoring, right? And by law, you're supposed to be sending progress monitoring home to the parents based on what your district has decided. So that's the data that's going to help your diagnosticians because they have to use that data to wrap around their diagnostics. So very, very important. So in Senate Bill 1153, there's this quote, and it says, well-defined instructional assessments benefit all learners by providing instructionally useful information. So it's very, very important that the data you're collecting in your teams, you're looking at it through the lens of tier 1, and how are you using that data in your PLCs for small group instruction? Because if I was your diagnostician, I'd be going, I'm really worried about, Billy, how did you change up the small group instruction in tier 1? And then I see your RTI plan had him doing that additional instruction. So now I have my progress monitoring in tier 2, that I'm looking at, but I'm also going to look at the teacher's formative and summative assessments in Tier 1 as well. And that's the data. That's the data for the next slide that I'm going to share with you. This is critically important for our special ed staff. And I'm sure we have some special ed staff with us today, and hopefully they're all going, hallelujah, Andrea, because it's really hard if you're not in special ed to understand this notion, especially on the academic side, these patterns of strengths and weaknesses. Now, I'm going to give you an abridged version. If I was looking at RTI data and the team said to me, well, he's below the 25th percentile in both reading and math, and additional data in both reading and math says he's not making a whole lot of progress in Tier 2, but he is. He's actually skirting right along that aim line. My hypothesis might be, well, this may not be a student with a disability because where's my pattern of strengths and weaknesses within the academic domain? But I don't know yet because I have to do what? My cognitive testing. So some of you have heard your diag say things like, well, when you look at his scores, he's not falling necessarily in the average range, but he's also not falling in the ID range. And so they used to call this, and it's a term that I intensely dislike, if I'm being honest with you, we're all friends here by now, is a slow learner. I think that's a negative connotation because the student isn't really a slow learner. What they're trying to tell you is the student's processing is not one that reaches a disability level on the lower end, but the kid's processing level also tells us that he's probably going to have difficulty keeping up with pace of instruction, right? So if you have a kid whose cognitive level is measured around anything above a 75 to a 90, that's a big range, they're going to struggle in school. The good news is a lot of our evidence-based practices tell us if we do the right Tier 1 small group added instruction and we really hit the nail on the head with embedding those skills and doing some foundational skill building in Tier 2 and Tier 3, they're going to be okay. They're going to be okay. But I think everyone gets nervous when you hear a diagnostician come up and say, well, you know, and I've had someone look at me sometimes with googly eyes and go, Andrea, Dr. O, how could this kid not be in special ed? He's failed first grade and he's still struggling. And I'm here to tell you, cognitively, this is what we need to do, but it's not a special ed issue, or maybe it is, okay? But it's critically important for all of our assessment personnel, our general ed folks, the RTI interventionist, our administrators, I'm sure I have some administrators with me today, to understand how to integrate and interpret these data sets so that we can get into this response pattern that supports special education. So let me give you an example. The student's overall IQ is like 95. Some of their G's, I'm sure you've heard of G's, but they're the substrates of their intelligence. So let's just say in reading, I'm really interested in 2 G's. I'm interested in GA, which is phonemic awareness, right? And then I'm also looking at maybe GC, which is more that language comprehension kind of things. It's a whole nother training. But if I have a GA that's a 74, I have an overall IQ that's a 95. I have specific falling below the 25th percentile on the universal screener. I have a trend analysis that tells me that the majority of second graders are above the 25th percentile. I have diagnostic data that says that that student's falling the lowest quadrant of the class. And then I have the teacher and I have all this RTI data of all the interventions and the lack of response to those interventions. I have a clear picture of a student that has a basic reading disability, right? Because the GA was a 74, basic reading skills on the Woodcock-Johnson was a 76, you know, all of that. But I have all these 90s. Math, the student's doing great math. The student's other G's that are related to math are strong. His math scores on the universal screener weren't stellar, but they were above the 25th percentile. But he struggles a little bit in math because he's having trouble
reading?
reading. All of his math diagnostic data says he's fine. I have a pattern. So that I guess I'm trying to I want you to understand that one score in isolation does not suffice for a disability condition. Even for our students that have intellectual disabilities, we're looking at the scores and we're looking at what, not only the cognition, but what the the students' daily living skills and those kind of things. And so for SPED, when a referral comes, even if the parent, y'all, I'm going to be honest with you. If a parent makes a referral SPED and the kid qualifies, I get really worried about the state of the RTI on that campus, because we should really be catching them in our universal screeners and our conversations with our teachers. But more likely, even at a parent referral, your diags still have to dig back. And so I tell diagnosticians, if a parent refers the child and the first thing I see is they don't fall below the 25th percentile, the first thing I'm going to write in my report is the student was not in a response to intervention situation because their scores were above what would have been expected for a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. And it's okay to say that. I try to tell teams, don't panic when you get a parent referral and just throw them in tier 2. Don't do that. Make sure your data takes you to tier 2. Okay, that's very important. But so we're going to look at that data regardless of the source of referral. A very strong MTSS RTI system will refer the kid through the process. And I'm going to tell you a few things about Child Find in a minute. But just something, this is a slide I use when I'm training diagnosticians and LSSPs, but I want the RTI folks that are here today to see this. Our Child Find process requirements tell us that in the FIE report, there are things that we must have. And again, I know some of you may not want to read 35 pages, but your diagnosticians and LSSPs work very, very hard. So one, we're addressing the concerns of the parents and the teachers. So regardless if we have a disability condition at the end, we have to really talk about what your concerns are. And our concerns are always data driven, right? We also have to educate the ARD committee, the team, and any future readers of the FIE why, basically why we've come to the conclusion we've come to with this student. And again, now on the academic side, we're really looking for all that academic data points in reading and math. On the SEL side, we're looking at those data points for how well we worked with our kids with trauma in a trauma-informed classroom. How well did we work with our kids in small group for SEL skill building? And I know that you had some wonderful speakers today talking about that. So we're putting that in the FIE as well. Also, then all of your data becomes the foundation of the IEPs or the PLAF. So I was involved in a case this year, and it was a case that was a federal case. And one of the biggest concerns that I had as part of the multidisciplinary team was the strength of the PLAF for the student. And so there was no question about a disability condition or not. The question was the strength of the PLAF. And one of the biggest frustrations I was having in helping the team was I couldn't get any solid data points. And that should have come through the whole process. And that was part of the reason that there was some strife going on was there was a need to build a good IEP, but we didn't have the data behind it. And and this is why Texas in Senate Bill 1153 kind of really came down hard on status monitoring data, because out in California, we had a federal case that went up through the circuit courts. And basically, at the end of the day, I don't have enough time to go into it, but at the end of the day, the 3-panel judge said in this Ninth Circuit decision that the IEPs that were developed for the child, that the RTI process wasn't a problem, but the IEPs were not developed using the RTI data because no one, and I'm not saying you have to do this, so don't panic, but I just want to tell you the context of this. No, there was not someone from the RTI team that could explain the data to the ARD committee. And in the ARD committee PLAF, they didn't have any mention. They were using DIBELS. In the California case, there was not any mention of the DIBELS in the progress monitoring in the PLAF. And so we had this Ninth Circuit decision that kind of rules the land. And so when Senate Bill 1153 was being drafted, some really good legislative staffers in Austin found Senate Bill 9, and that's why they incorporated the progress monitoring data in for you to send home to parents, because the parents have to be an equal partner at the IEP meeting. And so they have to understand the data we're using not only to qualify, right, establish the disability, but also what? To establish the need. So it's very important. So if my administrators are here listening to me today, one of the things that gets us in trouble sometimes with these child find violations is that we don't have that data in the PLAF. And that data is not coming from special ed. That data is really coming from everything you're doing in gen ed. So that's very important. And that's true at reeval, y'all, because very important. And then you're documenting all your compliance with your IDEA criteria. So that's what happens in the body of the FIE. And that's where some of this complexity happens with what you're doing. And so I tell your diagnosticians and LSSPs all the time, and those that are listening, is those are the data sources that help me even design my assessment when I'm looking for a disability condition. Because sometimes I have to dig deeper based on the data the RTI team gave me, because I don't know if this particular instrument I'm pulling is going to give me that data, like orthographic processing, right? If we have some kids that you're thinking there's some dysgraphia or written language disabilities, whatever it may be. And so it's vitally important that we have that data. And equally important, if I pull the kids, like say a parent made the referral and I pulled and the kid fell at the 20th percentile, and then I pull and I see that the district BAS, the kid is falling at C and should be at F, but you didn't have an RTI meeting, is mainly because of why? Because this happens, y'all. It's a good kid. Parents are working real hard with them after school. The kid is not one that's hitting your radars. Maybe some of the other kids that are a little more robust in their lack of motivation or whatever because they can't read. And so be careful. This happened to me about 3 years ago. I supervised an intern. We got a referral in 9th grade from a parent. And we went back in the data, and this kid should have been in RTI 3 times over, never made it to RTI, did not pass the STAR, and still was not in RTI, but the parent referred him. And I'm sitting there going, what gives? And here it was. The mom was a teacher, so she was working with the kid after school. Great kid. Everyone loved him. He had private tutors after school and everything. But the problem was he still wasn't growing. And then in 9th grade, mom was finally frustrated because she was worried about post-secondary. She made a referral, and here's this kid qualifying LD in reading in 9th grade. Y'all, you don't want to be there. You just don't want to be there. So 9 times out of 10 at a parent referral, I'm looking back and I don't have RTI data. That's okay, because that is data. I mean, a tier 2 data or tier 3. That's the important part here. So make sure you guys know what your district expectations are about when you're moving the kids through the tiers. But here's that universal screening data that I was talking to you about. So it's not just a universal screener that we're looking at. We're looking at multiple data sets. The trend analysis, now this is the important thing, and I've kind of touched on this, so I'm going to move forward because I want to make sure we have time for some questions. The trend analysis really tells us, does this child have access to instruction? So say we found a trend in 2nd grade, right? And we dug down to the campus level. And on this particular campus, the trend was in Mrs. Smith's class that was pulling everything down. And then I come to find out that Mrs. Smith is a ELL class, ESL class, bilingual class, whatever you call it, right? And 90% of the 2nd graders in the bilingual class or ESL class fell below the universal screener. But if we took that subcategory out and Billy is a 2nd language learner, then I can feel confident that Billy needs tier 2. But say Billy is a 2nd language learner, I can feel very confident as an RTI team is, well, what we need to fix is our tier 1. Does that make sense? Well, your diags are doing that too. Your diags are doing that too, because we have rule outs in special ed. And so if our rule out is language acquisition for some of our kids with reading in 1st or 2nd grade, then the student is not going to meet the IDEA disability criterion. And so we just did all this testing. Y'all, when your diags pull out kids, they're missing up to 13 or more hours of instruction, right? So when we're testing them, they're missing more instruction. So we want to test the right kids, okay? We don't want to miss any kids, but we want to test the right kids. So it's frustrating sometimes when we get a referral, and sometimes this happens. I'm not saying this happens in your school district. Sometimes teachers will just tell the parents to refer, and then they do, and the parents make the referral, and our first 3 or 4 data points are going to tell us right away, man, this kid's not going to qualify, but we're still going to test them, right? We're going to look at every angle because we want to give you all the information you have, but already my rule outs are kicking me out, such as absenteeism. So again, that access to instruction is very important from the viewpoint of your special ed assessments. So my question to all of you today is, does your special ed team, your LSSP, maybe the head of your SPED department, could be your diagnostician, your special ed teachers, have access? What I mean by this is one of the biggest mistakes I see that happens, and I don't think it's by any fault of anyone's, is our district folks and our campus folks train the teachers on the universal screener. They train the team, but somehow special ed doesn't get trained. So like I just had this happen where a school district, I'm in year 3. I've been asking for 3 years for the diagnosticians, the LSSPs, to have access to the NWEA data. It's a large school district, and they still haven't been trained. And so I'm like, how can they gather the data if they don't know what they're looking for? Because a lot of your assessments have multiple reports, and they should have access to those reports because they need that data. So if your SPED team has not been trained on what data sets you're using, I would highly recommend that happens, because it does take away from the time that they have to do other things. Because I think y'all know your DIAGs and LSSPs are in a little bit of a hole here. We have a lot of referrals coming in. But if they don't have access to the data, if not, why not? And the same goes true for your universal screening data and the data you collect for your SEL. Now, your counselors usually are primarily your point person there, but your LSSPs need that data. So what are you using? And can we all be trained, and are we all happy with it? So that's my question for you today. If not, why not? And if not, what can you all do to fix that? Because that's going to help in the long run with your child find and your IDEA process. So the needs to know that your DIAGs need to know is what also is your district diagnostic tools. I've listed some up there, right? But you might have other things. Does your diagnosticians know what you use from your diagnostic analysis, even when you're doing screening for dyslexia, right? I've had DIAGs say to me, I'm not really sure what they're doing for dyslexia. I'm like, well, you should know, because we're popping these kids at K1 developmentally, and we want to follow them and look at that review of data. So we want our diagnosticians to ask, what was the targeted skill or skills for tiers 1 and tiers 2 and 3 that you all are addressing aligned to whatever data your district has? That helps your DIAGs form the hypothesis of what possible disability condition we're looking at. So that's very, very important. It used to be that we can just pull out that bow and arrow and let it go and see where it falls. Your diagnosticians really need to have the data to tell us, are we suspecting a basic reading or maybe reading comprehension? Are we also suspecting dyslexia, as you all know? Are we suspecting a math or written language disability? Because it really is going to impact the data we collect at the IDEA level. And sometimes we can streamline that, and it really makes the process go a lot quicker. The other things your diagnosticians need to know is the norms you're using for rate of improvement. And the way you know what norms you're using is what assessment system you're using. Okay, so most of your assessment systems are using the ROI from the Tyndall, the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms, but Fuchs and Fuchs for math, Dr. Lynn Fuchs and her husband are at Vanderbilt University, and they were the lead folks at the national level for response to intervention that designed the math portion of ROI. We usually use those norms, but your DIAGs need to know that. Your DIAGs need to know if the students in tier 2 or tier 3, what instructional level or baseline you're intervening at, okay? Because that helps us understand that level of weakness. Because, honestly, the DIAG could get an 85 on an IQ score, and it could go either way. An 85 can be a strength, or an 85 can be a weakness. And I don't know until I look at all that other. And then your decision rules, excuse me. In your district-led process, in your district manual, and by the way, by now you all know that you should have a district manual. You should have written in what the decision rules that your district is using for determining if the intervention is working or not. So some school districts have 6-week rotations, so you can have them in tier 2 for 3 6 weeks. Some of you have 9-week rotations, so they might be in tier 2 for 9 weeks. And then what are you going to use as your response or your rate of improvement? And so the good thing is nowadays, if you're using a good instrument, the ROI is built in. If you're using a district-made instrument, because some of my smaller school districts aren't as lucky to have the resources and you have to build your own, then email me and I will give you some charts that you can use for your ROI. It's going to be the HAZBA charts and the Fuchs and Fuchs. I have no problem. I have my email on my last slide. You have all my slides, by the way. I think I gave you every single one. But if you have a question about ROI and what you should be including in your data, especially so that we can include it in the FIE, I will easily give you that information. Again, I'm pulling everything together, and I know I have about 15 minutes left. So it's very important. A couple of things. Do you ever invite your SPED team to your PLCs or your teacher team meeting? If not, why not? Especially if you're going into referral. Where are you housing those parent letters and your progress monitoring you're sending home? Does your SPED team have access to them? Very important. What about our ELL and bilingual students? Where's all that data? Is there easy access? And then the DIBELS, they have the Spanish version, the IDO. Now remember, if we have kids in RTI that are predominantly Spanish speaking, you should be doing the progress monitoring using the IDEL and not the DIBELS, right? You're going to do it in their native language. So AIMSweb also has a Spanish component to it, and some of our other assessments do as well. So just make sure you're using the right assessment and making sure your DIAGs and your LSSPs have access to all of them. So I have them all listed there for you. So once you have that done, how is that presented? Do you have a system like Frontline? You know, a lot of your special ed people use Frontline, used to be called eSped. A lot of your special ed systems have Success Ed. All of these systems have an RTI component. And so if you're documenting on a regular basis every 6 or 9 weeks and you can just upload it into that, it should connect to the SPED side. So that's what I would recommend for all of you. And then does your SPED team have access to other district data? I was evaluating a student last year with my intern, and it indicated the student was in Section 504, and I asked my intern to go gather the 504 data, and specifically if it was dyslexia. It took her hours to find the data because that's not something that traditionally SPED had access to. So we talked a lot about it. That was hours that we could have spent assessing and that kind of stuff. So just make sure that your system is user-friendly. Your DIAGs and your LSSPs are going to use a RIOT model. When I train on RTI and MTSS and data, I train the team to do RIOT. We use 4 components. All of the review of previously collected data, and that would include, that review there is your RTI stuff. Then we're going to interview our teachers and our parents based on the RTI data or universal screening data. Remember, classroom data is RTI data. The kid may never have been in Tier 2, but I have data, okay? We're going to test the student, and we're going to look at previous assessments, and then we're going to do several observations under IDEA. So that's our model for our multi-level of data collection, but noticing a lot of it comes back to instruction, curriculum, and environment, and that's where you are as an RTI team collecting that. Your DIAG is in the learner. The DIAG is really focused on the learner. The LSSP is focused on the learner, especially if there's emotional and behavioral issues. Okay. But the ICE, our CE needs to be addressed before we ever look at L. Because there's a lot of reasons children don't learn. And especially now post-COVID, and I'm sure you've had some training today on the trauma. I just went through some trauma training with the National Council, the NCTM, and it was very interesting, by the way. They were telling us as psychologists to be very careful. There's a big fear of over-identification for ADHD and for some of the biddies being AU because a lot of those behaviors mimic the executive function dysfunction you see in AU and ADHD. So really, we got to look at the ICE before the L. So that's what I tell my RTI teams all the time. But this is the rubric your diagnosticians and your LSSPs use when they're looking at child find. Now this is very important. This slide, I'm not going to read it off for you, is verbatim out of the TEA manual for MTSS and child find. Okay, what it says, and this is very important, we really want to see if the student can have data, that the team uses data to make sure we're giving the right level of support for students, right? And it really is important for us to differentiate between it being maybe an absenteeism or something else, trauma or something else, or a trend versus a within kid. But if the student is not responding sufficiently, that data really helps us with the decision. Now, it's very, very important. The next slide basically tells you the RTI process should never, ever be used to delay or deny an evaluation for eligibility under IDEA. So the reason for that is we got in trouble for this in our state, is that RTI teams were not collecting the data correctly, and the diagnosticians were looking at it going, why don't you go back to tier 2 and do 6 more weeks to collect this data for me so we understand if we have a good referral. You can't do that, y'all. If someone suspects a disability, they have a right to refer the kid, whether it's the teacher, the team, or the parent. Now, see, child find is very different than eligibility. Okay, child find means we're doing our due diligence to make sure that we assess all the children that there's a suspected disability, but it doesn't equate to eligibility or disability condition. So if you refer and the student's above the 25th percentile, not that far below from their peers, not you, maybe a parent or maybe a teacher because they're really worried about Johnny and they don't want to wait to try RTI, but all our data isn't showing a suspected disability, a couple things can happen. Your special ed director can write a notice of refusal to assess, which we don't like to do because it makes everyone mad, but they can. And they should if there's real data that says this is not a good referral, but most people don't. Or we test, but now we're testing and on the back of our minds, we're like, oh my gosh, there's really our beginning data sets. I'm already at a D&Q and I didn't even open my test kit yet, okay? And that makes me anxious because I'm spending all this time, so now I'm trying to figure out how to look at my data differently because I don't want people being upset. Because honestly, when you refer a kid for special ed, what you're saying to the parent is our next step is specially designed instruction. So we don't want people getting upset if an IDEA disability is not detected. But it's very important that does not equate to child find. So if someone suspects a disability, I recommend you have good data to support that suspecting. Go ahead and refer. But be ready that you could get a notice of refusal. You could. Or be ready that it's a D&Q. And I'm sitting there going, well, then why did we do this at this point? Shouldn't we have tried some interventions? But say you're in the middle of tier 2 and you've done 10 weeks and Billy is progressing like at 1 word correct. We expect a 2 to 3 word correct. You may not want to do tier 3. You may refer for special ed. Your data needs to drive you in that decision. But this OSEP memo was dated January this year. The problem we're having right now with COVID is we have so much COVID learning loss that we're jumping to referrals and we don't have that access to appropriate instruction because we have all these trends, and then we find out the kid during the asynchronous or synchronous learning was absent half the time. You know, that's a rule out, right? So we just want to be careful with that. So, and so the Office of Special Ed, OSEP, Office of Special Ed, OSEP is the feds, okay? But we're in trouble here in Texas right now. So just a reminder from TEA, it should be provided through the collaborative efforts of both general and high language now. So TEA is expecting that we all kind of hold hands. And the other quick reminder is you can have a student with a disability and they still have access to all the tiers in MTSS. So we have a student that has a speech-only disability. That's the most common scenario. They're coming into kindergarten, first grade, speech only. They're halfway through first grade. They're starting to have reading issues. Well, yes, it's an ARD committee's decision to look at the data and make a referral, right? Because the kid's in special ed. But that student has a civil right to be getting the RTI. So we don't say, okay, we're not going to put them in. We have this great, we're using Lexia Learning in tier 2, or maybe My Virtual Reading Coach, something, right? We have this great resource. but he can't have access to it because he's a speech-only kid. SPED has to take care of him. No, 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 no. So remember that students with disabilities, the referral for additional assessment is going to come through the yard, but here's the catcher here. Speech-only kid still has to show whether they have adequate access to instruction, right? Even when we're testing them for an additional disability. So provide the resources and supports, work with your special ed folks and your art committee, but they still have access to anything that you offer. That's critically important. So the lessons learned, so we have a few minutes if there's any questions. Train all your staff. Make sure everyone understands your operational definitions of those processes that I talked to you about, especially your data. Your team is actively involved with all these data sets, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We have a natural instructional day, and we have documentation that's easy, that connects to the special ed world, and can easily enhance all of our conversations. And then if any of you have seen me talk in the last year or two, and so, you know, I've written 7 books on RTI. My last 2 books came out in the last year and a half. The behavior one came out right as, or actually 2 years, as COVID hit. But in these books and in my trainings for Ed 311, this is your big picture. If you've not seen any of my trainings, is under Senate Bill 1153, there's 3 criteria we look at, right? So we're looking at the data that you collect, the intervention that you designed, and making sure the plan adequately tells us whether we have access to instruction and intervention. So those 3 key pieces. So I put this in your handout for you. And so that's what your special ed folks are going to be looking for as we go through, you know, that. Now on the SEL side, I just want to be clarify with you is we're going to look to see what kind of things you've done to help support those kids from that perspective. I know I only left a little less than 5 minutes, but hopefully, Jana, do we have any questions? I know that was a very quick clip here, but I'm hoping that today you found value in trying to conceptualize what this means from a special ed perspective so that you understand the other side of the coin. It's not like special ed is trying to make things difficult for RTI. I mean, we have federal criteria that tells us what we should be doing. Okay, Jana. I see the question. I've got feedback here. It says, in regards to a student receiving SPED services in RTI, can they receive the same RTI designated supports? I say yes, but listen, one of the things that I want to be very clear about, we should not be using RTI in lieu of an IEP. So we have kids that are on, let's just say you have a student that has that's in-class support. So in a co-taught class for reading, and the in-class support is not sufficient. What is the specially designed instruction that special ed's going to do? You're not going to say, well, the in-class support isn't working, so we're going to put them also in RTI, and the RTI is going to take care of that. You don't do that. That's an art committee decision. So yes, a student in special ed, the more typical thing I see is the students in special ed for reading that's really struggling in math because the reading is impacting the math. That student has every right to any math intervention you're doing at tier 2 and tier 3. I think it's easier to describe it that way than to say the student's struggling in reading and I want to also, besides the IEP, give them this. Absolutely. But there's only so many hours in a day, and I know you guys had someone talking to you about how to even schedule your days for intervention time. So a lot of my school districts now in their master schedule, they're offering the IEP supports during the same time RTI supports are. So making sure that your RTI intervention doesn't supplant the IEP, but it could support the IEP. Additionally, we see it used only in an area maybe IEP's written, if that makes sense. But yes, our student special ed have a right to any and all of those supports. Now, here's a far out example. I had a student in a school district I was working with, my intern, was ID, but very high functioning ID. So the student did have IEPs in reading and math and in written expression, but it was determined that the RTI was also using an additional reading intervention they thought would be helpful. So the student really got that intervention as part of their small group tier 1 instruction, because the student was in in co-taught classes because it was a high functioning ID kid. I think the student's IQ was like low 70s, like 71, 72. So the student was ID and the student was getting some pull out resource. But, and this was a middle school student, was getting some pull out resource. But during the reading, the student was also double blocked. This middle school had a double block. So in that second double block, there were RTI kids. And so they actually had some small group instruction using a reading intervention program. So he was also given that. So he's ID on an IEP in a co-taught class, second block of reading, he was getting the same reading intervention that the tier 2 kids were getting. So, I mean, it's just a layer upon layer upon layer. Good question. Jana, I don't know if you can hear me, but is there any other questions? Okay. Well, I said a lot in 1 hour. So what I would ask you to do is you can look through my slides when you have time to process. If any questions come up, feel free to email me or Lacey. Lacey knows how to get a hold of me, and we'll be glad to give you any resources you need. Thank you all for what you do every day for our kids. Enjoy the time you have left before school starts.